Jinha Park sat at her kitchen table, staring at the letter that had just arrived. The rent was going up again. She pushed her long black hair away from her face and sighed deeply. This was the 6th increase since she moved into this apartment, building in Lahore. Each year the landlord found some excuse: property taxes, maintenance costs, market rates. But her salary as a graphic designer hadn't kept pace with these endless increases. The morning sunlight streamed through her window. As she made coffee, her mind racing. At 34, Jinna had built a comfortable life here. Her apartment walls were covered with her own artwork and photos from her travels. She had made this place her home, but lately she wondered if she was just throwing money away. Another 5,000 rupees per month, she muttered to herself, calculating what this would mean for her budget. That's 60,000 more per year. Jinna worked remotely for a design agency based in Seoul. Her job allowed her flexibility, but the rising costs of city living were eating away at her savings. She had been planning a 2-week vacation to visit her cousin in northern Pakistan, her first real break in over a year. Now this letter made her question everything. That evening, Jinna called her friend Sumin. "I just don't understand how they can keep doing this," Jinna said, pacing around her living room. "The building isn't getting any newer. The facilities haven't improved. What exactly am I paying more for?" "Have you thought about moving?" Sumin asked. "Where to? Rents are high everywhere in the city center. And I need good internet for work," Jinna replied. After hanging up, Jinna opened her laptop and began researching housing costs across Lahore. What she found shocked her. Rent increases far outpaced inflation. She fell down a rabbit hole of housing rights websites, tenant forums, and alternative living arrangements. 3 hours later, Jinna was still online, now reading about people who had found creative solutions to housing problems. One story particularly caught her attention: a software developer who had sublet his apartment while traveling and discovered he could cover most of his rent this way. Jinna looked around her apartment. It was clean, well-furnished, and in a good location. Tourists and visiting professionals would probably pay good money to stay here for a short period. She checked the calendar. Her vacation was starting in 3 days. Not much time to arrange anything, but maybe just enough. The next morning, Jinna woke up with a clear plan forming in her mind. This wasn't just about saving money anymore. This was about challenging a system that seemed designed to squeeze every rupee from working people like her. She spent her lunch break taking photos of her apartment and creating a listing on a home-sharing platform. By evening, she had 3 inquiries. One stood out. Professor Kim, a visiting lecturer at Lahore University, needed accommodations for exactly the 2 weeks Jinna would be away. They video-called that night, and Jinna felt comfortable with the soft-spoken academic. They agreed on terms, and Jinna sent over a rental agreement she had downloaded and customized. The next day was a whirlwind of activity. Jinna packed away her personal items into storage boxes. She deep-cleaned the apartment, put fresh linens on the bed, and typed up a welcome guide with local recommendations and emergency contacts. That night, as she finished her preparations, Jinna felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. What had started as frustration over a rent increase had turned into something bigger, a small act of rebellion against a housing system she felt was unfair. She sat on her balcony, looking out at the Lahore skyline as darkness fell. The city. Lights twinkled below her. Jinna had always loved this view, but tonight she saw it differently. Each light represented someone's home, someone possibly facing the same struggles she was. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. Jinna decided her vacation wouldn't just be about relaxation anymore. She would use this time to explore different neighborhoods, talk to locals about housing, and research alternative living arrangements. Maybe she could find a better way, not just for herself, but as an example for others too, as she packed the last of her things for tomorrow's early departure. Jinna felt a newfound determination. The landlord's letter lay on her counter, but it no longer filled her with dread. Instead, it had sparked something new, a challenge to the status quo, a first step toward change. Jinna set her alarm and climbed into bed. Tomorrow wouldn't just be the start of her vacation. It would be the beginning of her housing experiment, a test case for a radical idea that might just change her life and inspire others to question the norms they had accepted for too long. The morning sun was just peeking over the horizon when Gina handed the keys to Professor Kim, a middle-aged man with round glasses and a kind smile. "The internet password is on the fridge," Gina explained, pointing to her neatly written welcome note. "And if anything goes wrong with the plumbing, Mr. Hamid downstairs can help. His number is also on the note." Professor Kim nodded appreciatively. "This is much nicer than university housing. Thank you for trusting me with your home." As Gina walked away from her apartment building, rolling her suitcase behind her, she felt a strange mix of freedom and anxiety. She had never handed her keys to a stranger before, but the money from this 2-week sublet would cover nearly half her monthly rent, money that would normally just disappear into her landlord's pocket. The bus ride to her cousin Hana's house in northern Pakistan took 5 hours. Gina spent the time on her laptop, creating a spreadsheet to track her expenses and potential savings. She also made a list of neighborhoods to explore during her stay. "You're on vacation and you're still working?" asked the elderly woman sitting next to her, peering curiously at Gina's screen. Gina smiled. "It's not exactly work, more like a personal project." She explained her housing experiment to the woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Fatima. By coincidence, Mrs. Fatima's son owned several small apartment buildings outside Lahore. "The big landlords are the problem," Mrs. Fatima said, shaking her head. "They buy up everything and then raise rents however they want. My son keeps his rents fair, but he struggles to compete." They exchanged phone numbers before parting ways at the bus station. Gina's first networking connection was made before her experiment had even properly begun. Hana welcomed Gina with open arms and a table full of food. Her house was modest but comfortable, located in a quiet neighborhood with mountains visible in the distance. "You can stay as long as you want," Hana insisted. "The guest room is yours." That night, after catching up with her cousin, Gina checked her phone to find a message from Professor Kim with a photo of her apartment. "Everything is perfect. Thank you again," he wrote. Gina felt a wave of relief. Step 1 of her experiment was working smoothly. The next morning, instead of sleeping in as she'd planned, Gina woke early. She made a quick breakfast and told Hana about her plans. "I'm going to explore some neighborhoods today," she explained. "I want to see what housing options exist outside the city." Hana looked confused. "But you're on vacation. Shouldn't you be relaxing?" Gina smiled. "This is actually exciting for me. I've lived in the same place for 6 years. I want to see what else is out there." Her first stop was a small town about 40 minutes from Lahore by train. Gina had read online that many people were moving here for the lower costs while commuting to work in the city. Walking through the streets, Gina took photos and notes on her phone. Apartment buildings here were newer than in her neighborhood, yet the rent signs advertised prices nearly 30% lower than what she paid. She stopped at a local tea shop and struck up a conversation with the owner. "Oh yes, many city people moving here now," the shop owner confirmed. "My son just rented his spare room to a lady who works in Lahore. She only goes to the office 3 days a week." This was exactly the kind of arrangement Gina could imagine for herself. With her remote work flexibility, she wouldn't need to commute daily. Over the next few days, Gina developed a routine. Mornings were spent with Hana or visiting tourist sites. Afternoons were dedicated to her housing research. She visited 4 different communities within commuting distance of Lahore, each with its own character and cost of living. In one neighborhood, she discovered a newly built co-living space. The building had been converted from an old factory, with private bedrooms but shared kitchens and living areas. The monthly cost was remarkably low. "Can I look around?" Gina asked the property manager, a young woman named Yuna. "Of course, are you thinking of moving in?" Yuna seemed excited at the prospect. "Maybe. I'm doing some research right now." Yuna gave her a tour, showing her the modern facilities and introducing her to some residents. One was a web developer who worked remotely like Gina. Another was a teacher who commuted to Lahore 3 days a week. "The best part is the community," Yuna explained. "We have dinner together twice a week. There's always someone to talk to if you're feeling lonely." This was something Gina hadn't considered. In her apartment building, she barely knew her neighbors. The idea of built-in community was appealing. On day 10 of her vacation, Jinnah received another message from Professor Kim. "Your apartment is so conveniently located. My colleagues at the university are jealous. Would you consider another arrangement in the future?" This got Jinnah thinking. What if she could regularly sublet her place when she traveled, or even for part of each month? The possibilities were expanding in her mind. That evening, Jinnah sat with Hannah on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You know," Hannah said, "when you first told me about this housing experiment, I thought you were being a bit dramatic. But seeing how excited you get talking about it, I think you're onto something." Jinnah nodded. "It's not just about saving money anymore. It's about finding a better way to live. Why should we accept that housing has to be this expensive burden? There are other options out there." As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Jinnah updated her spreadsheet with the day's findings. What had started as a simple vacation had transformed into something much more meaningful. She wasn't just challenging her own housing situation, she was discovering alternatives that could help others too, and she still had 4 days left to explore. Jinnah woke up early on the 11th day of her vacation, her mind buzzing with new ideas. She had arranged to meet someone who might change her entire perspective on housing. Sipping her morning tea on Hannah's porch, she watched the neighborhood come alive while checking her messages. Professor Kim had sent another photo, this time of her apartment's balcony garden, which looked surprisingly better than when she left it. "Your plants are thriving," he wrote. "I hope you don't mind that I've been talking to them." Jinnah smiled. The sublet experiment was working better than she had expected. Not only was she earning back some rent money, but her home was being well cared for too. After breakfast, Jinnah caught a local bus to a nearby town where she had arranged to meet Tae-ho Kim, an architect she'd connected with through an online forum about alternative housing. The bus wound through lush green countryside, and Jinnah found herself wondering why she had stayed locked in her expensive city apartment for so long, when such beauty existed just a short distance away. The coffee shop where they agreed to meet was small, but bustling with people working on laptops. Jinnah immediately noticed a tall man waving at her from a corner table. "You must be Jinnah," Tae-ho said, standing to greet her. His friendly smile put her at ease immediately. "I brought some floor plans to show you." Over the next hour, Tae-ho explained how he had transformed an abandoned textile factory into a thriving co-living community. His eyes lit up as he spread drawings across the table, showing how the old industrial space had been divided into private living quarters while preserving common areas for shared activities. "The monthly cost is about 1/3 of what you're paying now," Tae-ho explained when Jinnah told him about her apartment. "And that includes internet, utilities, and weekly community meals." "But how did you make it work financially?" Jinnah asked, genuinely curious. The math seemed impossible based on her understanding of property costs. "We formed a housing cooperative," Tae-ho explained. 25 people pooled resources to buy the building outright. No landlord means no profit margin added to our living costs. We only pay for actual expenses and maintenance. Jinnah's mind was racing. "Could I see it? The building, I mean." Tae-ho checked his watch. "Actually, we're having a community lunch today. Why don't you come as my guest? You can see everything and meet some residents." 2 hours later, Jinnah stood in awe. Inside the former factory, sunlight streamed through massive windows that once illuminated industrial machinery, but now brightened a spacious common area where about 15 people were setting up for lunch. The high ceilings and exposed brick gave the space character, while comfortable furniture and plants made it feel homey. "This is amazing," Jinnah whispered, taking in the scene. A woman approximately Jinnah's age approached them. "You must be the graphic designer Tae-ho mentioned," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Hee-Jin Lee. I work in digital marketing, mostly remotely like you." Over lunch, Jinnah met residents from various backgrounds, a teacher, several tech workers, an accountant, even a doctor who commuted to Lahore 3 days a week. What struck her most was how connected everyone seemed. Unlike her apartment building, where neighbors barely acknowledged each other, these people shared meals, stories, and genuine friendship. "The best part isn't even the cost savings," Ye-jin told her as they toured her private living space. a comfortably sized room with a small ensuite bathroom. It's having people around when you want company, but still having your own space when you need quiet. Later, Hyojin introduced Jinnah to two international remote workers who were staying in the building's guest quarters for a month. They called themselves digital nomads and explained how they traveled the world while working online. "We stay places for a few weeks or months," explained Kai, a website developer from Japan. "It's cheaper than traditional housing, and we get to experience different cultures. Plus, spaces like this come with built-in friends." That evening, Jinnah stayed for a game night in the common area. She found herself laughing and connecting with people in a way she hadn't experienced since college. The sense of community was palpable, something she'd been missing without even realizing it. How difficult would it be for someone new to join? Jinnah asked Taeho as he walked her to the bus stop later that night. "We actually have 2 spots opening next month," he replied. "Members moving abroad. The buy-in is significant, but much less than a traditional down payment. Are you seriously considering it?" Jinnah nodded slowly. "I think I am." Back at Hana's house, Jinnah couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to the converted factory, the friendly faces, the sense of belonging. She opened her laptop and began researching housing cooperatives in and around Lahore, discovering there were several, each with slightly different models. She sent a message to Professor Kim, asking if he'd be interested in a longer-term arrangement for her apartment if she decided to move. His enthusiastic response came within minutes, despite the late hour. The next morning, Jinnah received a message from Mrs. Fatima, the woman she'd met on the bus. "My son would like to talk to you about your housing ideas," it read. "He's interested in creating more affordable options." Jinnah felt something shift inside her. What had started as a personal experiment to save money was expanding into something much bigger. She was connecting with people who shared her frustrations and her vision for change. That afternoon, Jinnah returned to the co-living space with her laptop. Hyojin had invited her to work alongside the community for the day, to get a feel for daily life there. As she sat in the sunny common area, watching people come and go, occasionally stopping to chat or share ideas, Jinnah realized she felt more at home among these strangers than she had in her own apartment building for years. "You look like you belong here," Taeho said, sitting down beside her with a cup of tea. Jinnah smiled. "Maybe I do." She looked around at the space once more, imagining herself as part of this community. For the first time in years, housing didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an opportunity, not just to save money, but to live better. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the factory's large windows, Jinnah realized her vacation was almost over. Soon, she would return to her apartment in Lahore. But she wouldn't be the same person who left 2 weeks ago. She had discovered not just new housing options, but a new way of thinking about home itself. The taxi pulled up in front of Jinnah's apartment building, just as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Lahore. After 2 weeks away, the familiar sight of her building brought mixed feelings. It was home, but it also represented the housing system she now questioned. "Welcome back," said the doorman with a friendly wave. "How was your trip?" "Life-changing," Jinnah replied, and she meant it. Upstairs, she found her apartment spotlessly clean. Professor Kim had left a thank-you note on the counter, along with a small potted plant and his business card. "For future arrangements," he had written. Jinnah smiled, placing her bags down and walking to the balcony. The city sprawled before her, the same view she'd looked at for 6 years, but her perspective had completely changed. That evening, after unpacking, Jinnah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, finalizing her calculations. The money from subletting had covered 45% of her monthly rent. If she did this regularly during her travels, or even rented out her spare room occasionally, she could significantly reduce her housing costs without moving. But the rent increase notice still sat on her counter, reminding her of the larger issue. No matter how creative she got with subletting, her landlord would continue raising the rent year after year. Jinnah slept restlessly that night, her mind racing with all she had learned during her vacation. The next morning, she made a decision. Instead of simply accepting the rent increase or looking for a new place alone, she would try something bolder. She printed out her research findings, including charts comparing rent increases in their building to actual property value changes and inflation rates. She prepared a simple proposal. Keep rent increases tied to the actual cost of maintaining the building, not arbitrary market rates that seemed designed to maximize profit regardless of tenant hardship. At exactly 10 a.m., Jinnah knocked on her landlord's office door in the building's lobby. Mr. Qadir looked up from his desk with mild surprise. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s who managed several properties across the city. "Ah, Miss Park, come to pay your increased rent early?" "Actually, I wanted to discuss the increase," Jinnah said, placing her folder on his desk. She kept her voice calm and professional as she explained her research and proposal. As she spoke, Mr. Qadir's expression changed from surprise to amusement to irritation. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Miss Park, this is business, not charity. My costs go up, rent goes up. That's how it works in every building in this city. But your costs haven't gone up 8% this year," Jinnah countered, pointing to her charts. "And I've been a reliable tenant for 6 years. Wouldn't you rather keep good tenants than have constant turnover?" Mr. Qadir's smile didn't reach his eyes. "There are 20 people who would take your apartment tomorrow if you left. That's the reality of the market. But the increase stands," he said firmly, sliding her folder back across the desk. "Pay it or find somewhere else to live. That's your choice." Jinnah left his office with her cheeks burning, but she wasn't defeated. If anything, Mr. Qadir's dismissive attitude strengthened her resolve. That evening, Jinnah did something she'd never done before. She slipped notes under her neighbors' doors, inviting them to meet in the building's courtyard the following evening to discuss the rent increases. She had no idea if anyone would show up. The next day at work, Jinnah could hardly focus on her design projects. She kept checking her phone, finding messages from 2 neighbors already confirming they would come. By lunchtime, 3 more had responded. When evening came, Jinnah arranged some chairs in the courtyard, wondering if she was overstepping. What if nobody came? What if Mr. Qadir found out? To her surprise, 11 people showed up, nearly half the building's tenants. Some brought snacks or drinks. Others brought stories of their own frustrations with the constant rent increases. "My salary goes up maybe 3% a year, but my rent goes up 7 to 8%, said Junho, a middle-aged teacher who lived on the 4th floor. "It can't keep going like this." I lived here for 12 years, added Mrs. Malik, an elderly widow. "When my husband was alive, the rent was manageable. Now it takes most of my pension." Jinnah shared what she had learned during her vacation about housing cooperatives, co-living spaces, and tenant rights. She explained how buildings like theirs often changed ownership between investment groups that cared only about profit margins, not people. "But what can we do?" asked Nari, a young nurse. "If we complain, they'll just find new tenants." "Not if we stand together," Jinnah said. "One tenant they can ignore. But if the whole building threatens to leave at once, that would cost them months of lost rent and new tenant fees." The group talked for 2 hours, sharing frustrations and ideas. By the end, they had formed a tenants association with Jinnah as the spokesperson. Their first act would be drafting a collective letter to Mr. Qadir and the property management company, signed by everyone present. Over the next week, word spread through the building. More tenants joined their cause. Jinnah connected with housing rights advocates who offered free advice. She learned about local regulations that landlords often ignored, counting on tenants not knowing their rights. 10 days after her meeting with Mr. Qadir, Jinnah returned to his office, but not alone. 5 other tenants came with her, representing their newly formed association. They brought a letter signed by 17 households, demanding negotiations on the rent increase and improvements to building maintenance that had been promised but never delivered. Mr. Qadir's face darkened as he read the letter. "This is ridiculous. You can't dictate terms to me." "We're not dictating," Jinnah replied calmly. "We're negotiating, as is our right as tenants. And if I refuse, then we'll all start looking for new places to live," said Junho firmly. "And we'll make sure potential new tenants know exactly why so many people left at once." The meeting ended without resolution, but Jinnah felt something had shifted. As they left the office, Mrs. Malik squeezed her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "For years I felt so alone with this problem, now I don't." That night, Jinnah received a message from Teho, checking if she was still interested in the co-living space. A spot had opened up sooner than expected. Jinnah looked around her apartment, thinking about the choice before her. She could move to the co-living community and leave this building behind. Or she could stay and fight for change that would help not just herself, but all her neighbors. Either way, she was no longer passively accepting a housing system that seemed designed to take advantage of people's basic need for shelter. And that alone felt like victory. The morning sun streamed through the large windows as Jinnah watered the community garden on the rooftop of her new home. 6 months had passed since that life-changing vacation, and her daily routine now included tending to these shared vegetables before starting work. From this height, she could see her old apartment building in the distance, a place that had once defined her life, but now represented just one chapter in her housing journey. "Those tomatoes are coming along nicely," said Hyejin, joining her with a cup of tea. "Hard to believe you were worried about not having a green thumb." Jinnah smiled, remembering how nervous she'd been about moving into the co-living space. The decision hadn't been easy. Even after the confrontation with Mr. Qadir, she had wrestled with whether to stay and fight or start fresh somewhere new. In the end, she chose both. After moving into the converted factory building with Teho, Hyejin and the others, Jinnah had kept her promise to the tenants in her old building. Every Wednesday evening, she returned to help them organize their association, bringing the knowledge she was gaining from housing rights groups across the city. "Jinnah, your interview is live," called Teho from the common area downstairs. Jinnah quickly dried her hands and hurried down to join the small crowd gathered around the television. There she was, on the city's most watched morning news program, talking about alternative housing solutions and tenant rights. "Housing doesn't have to be this constant struggle," her on-screen self was saying confidently. "People are finding creative solutions all over Lahore, from co-living spaces to housing cooperatives to tenants associations that negotiate collectively." The host looked genuinely interested. "And you've experienced all these personally?" "Yes," screamed Jinnah replied. "I live in a co-living community that reduced my housing costs by 40% while giving me more social connection than I ever had in my apartment. And I help run a tenants association that recently negotiated a fair contract with a major property management company." Everyone in the room cheered at this mention of their recent victory. After 3 months of organization and pressure, Mr. Qadir's company had finally agreed to limit rent increases to 3% annually and commit to specific building improvements for all their properties. "You're famous now," teased Hyejin as the segment ended. Jinnah laughed. "Hardly. But if my story helps even a few people rethink their housing options, it's worth being on camera, even though it makes me nervous." Her phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from friends, questions from strangers who had seen the interview, and an invitation to speak at a university housing forum next month. Jinnah still found it strange to be considered an expert on something that, just 6 months ago, she had known nothing about. Later that afternoon, Jinnah cycled to a coffee shop where she had scheduled meetings with 3 different people seeking housing advice. These informal counseling sessions had become part of her routine, a way of paying forward the knowledge she had gained. The first meeting was with a young couple frustrated by rising rents. Jinnah listened to their situation, then outlined several options they hadn't considered, including a new housing cooperative forming on the east side of Lahore. "We never knew these alternatives existed," the woman said, eyes wide with possibility. "Most people don't," Jinnah replied. "We're taught that traditional renting or buying are the only options, but that's just not true." Her second meeting was with Jun Ho from her old building. The Tenants Association was still going strong, but they needed advice on dealing with maintenance issues. "Mr. Qadir is dragging his feet on the roof repairs," Jun Ho explained. "He says it's scheduled, but nothing happens." Jinnah pulled out her laptop and showed him a template for documenting maintenance requests. "Keep records of everything, dates, times, who you spoke with. If they know you're tracking it all, they're more likely to follow through." After her meetings, Jinnah cycled to the city's housing authority office. 6 weeks ago, she had started volunteering there one afternoon a week, helping people understand their rights as tenants. Today she was meeting with the director about a proposed change to the city's rental regulations. "Your input on this has been invaluable," the director told her, reviewing Jinnah's notes on the draft policy. "We need more voices from actual tenants, not just landlords and developers." Jinnah never would have imagined herself helping shape housing policy, but her experience had given her insights that many officials lacked. Her design background also proved useful. She created infographics that made complex housing rights information accessible to everyone. By evening, Jinnah was tired but satisfied as she cycled back to her co-living community. Tonight was community dinner night, and she had promised to help cook. These shared meals twice a week had become one of her favorite parts of her new lifestyle. So different from the solitary dinners in her old apartment. The common area was buzzing with activity when she arrived. Someone had strung up lights for a birthday celebration later. The kitchen smelled of spices as 3 residents collaborated on dinner. In one corner, a weekly language exchange was happening, with people teaching each other phrases in Urdu, Korean, and English. "There you," heard Taeho called, waving her over to the kitchen. "We need your famous kimchi pancakes for tonight." As Jinnah washed her hands and tied on an apron, she reflected on how profoundly her life had changed. Her housing costs had dropped significantly. She had more friends and connections than ever before. And she had found purpose in helping others navigate housing challenges. After dinner, the birthday celebration for one of the newer residents turned into an impromptu talent show. Jinnah found herself laughing until her sides hurt as people shared songs, magic tricks, and funny stories. Later, sitting on the rooftop garden with a small group watching the stars come out over Lahore, Jinnah's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from a publishing company interested in turning her housing journey into a guidebook for others. "Good news?" asked Hyejin, noticing Jinnah's surprised expression. "Maybe," Jinnah replied, showing her the email. "Apparently my blog posts about all this have been getting attention." "You should do it," Taeho encouraged. "Your story could help so many people." Jinnah looked out at the city lights, thinking about the path that had led her here. It had started with a simple vacation and a frustrating rent increase notice. She never could have predicted that those two things would combine to completely transform not just where she lived, but how she lived and what she stood for. 6 months ago, she had been a graphic designer frustrated by housing costs. Now, she was still a designer but also an advocate, a community member, and a voice for change in a system many people had accepted as unchangeable. As the night grew cooler and stars filled the sky above the city, Jinnah felt a deep sense of contentment. Her home was no longer just the private space where she slept and kept her belongings. It was this community, these people, and the movement they were all building together, a movement toward housing that was not just affordable, but also connected, sustainable and fair. What had begun as one woman's challenge to rent norms had become something much bigger than herself, and it was only just beginning.